Welcome back to our series, Key Battles of World War I. In the last episode, we looked at the Treaty of Versailles. It's all that it promised peace, but that promise didn't hold very long. And you can take a look at World War II if you want to know more about that. But throughout the series, we looked at all these different larger-than-life figures, and it pays to see, where do they end up? Where do you go after you've led armies of millions of people? Or you're the leader of a nation that no longer exists anymore. So we're going to bite that off and take a look at where all these people go, leaders of the Allied Alliance, leaders of the Central Powers, and then others. Whom among the Soviet Union, where do they end up? Who holds on to power? Who goes into exile? Well, let's begin by looking at the Allies, and James and I are going to go back and forth and say what happens to different people. First, David Lloyd George. In 1922, he loses his position as prime minister, but like many parliamentary figures, he doesn't just leave. Sometimes he's voted out of office, but then he comes back. And he's going to remain active in British politics until his death in 1945 at the age of 82. So he's there for both the First and Second World Wars. Someone else who is there for the First World War and shows up and plays a fairly prominent role in the Second World War. Who's that, James?
Yeah. Speaking of people who don't just go away, but they keep coming back. Winston Churchill, man, what a colorful figure. What an amazing figure. Just a monumental, towering giant of 20th century history. You could have a whole series. In fact, I did hear an entire 7-part podcast series on the life of Churchill once, but we won't do that to you folks. We'll just mention again that he had been the architect or one of the architects of the Gallipoli campaign. He had been the First Lord of the Admiralty, basically in charge of the British Navy, lost that position, came back in some minor government positions, but really wasn't super powerful during World War I after Gallipoli. As everybody knows, he became prime minister in 1940 and helped lead Britain to victory over the Nazis. Gosh, that's all I have, Scott, but I've got to say a couple other things. It just seems wrong to dismiss Churchill in one sentence, right? Or two. Churchill, of course, as I already said, was a great war leader, refused to give up. We shall never surrender. It's interesting that Churchill was actually voted out of office before World War II was over. It's like this amazing guy that we all, from our perspective, think was so great, but the British were tired of him. They voted him out. He was replaced by Clement Attlee. In fact, I may be getting some details wrong here, but I believe it was at the final conference of the Big Three at the end of World War II. That was the Potsdam Conference. It was him, and it was Harry Truman. By that time, Roosevelt had died, and it was Stalin, but Churchill got word that he had been voted out of office, so he actually had to leave in the middle of the conference and was replaced at the conference by his successor, Clement Attlee. Churchill later becomes prime minister again in the early 50s, and in fact, he's the prime minister when Queen Elizabeth II becomes the sovereign of England, and he was very helpful to her in learning how to be a modern-day king or queen. All right, so that's Churchill.
Right, and let's we'll just get stuck on Churchill for a bit, but I'd like to mention that he was quite prophetic. There's a book about him. I forget the author. It's called Churchill, the Prophetic Statesman, that his prognostications about the 20th century, many of them came true, especially in light of the Cold War.
Yeah, I didn't even talk about the Iron Curtain speech, but there's just so much.
And he gave the Iron Curtain speech in Missouri, the state where I currently reside, when he was traveling in the United States, I think in the 1950s. Famously, a very unpleasant house guest. Many who hosted him didn't want to host him again. He was used to being Sir Winston and making demands, and had many witty remarks when he had a lot of alcohol. If you were on the receiving end of the witty remarks when you were hosting him, many people didn't appreciate that. So it doesn't get much more colorful than Sir Winston, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Well, moving down the line, I don't have a lot to say about Sir John French, but he was Lieutenant of Ireland until his retirement from the Army in 1921. He was given the honorary title of Lord of Ypres in 1922.
Purely an honorific.
Right, where there was the site of somewhere between 3 and 5 battles. Not exactly sure. Died of cancer in 1925 at the age of 72.
I always think about Sir John French. He hated the French, and he didn't refuse to learn to speak French. It was funny, but his successor was, of course, Sir Douglas Haig. Haig was given 100,000 pounds, pounds sterling, the money, by Parliament after the war. Now, that's a pretty good chunk of change if you can get it.
Yeah.
But he never became chief of staff of the British Army. He never rose above the rank of or the position of commander of the BEF. He spent the rest of his career raising money for veterans until he died in 1928 at the age of 67. And evaluating Haig, it's hard to, well, you certainly can't say he was just a brilliant military genius. I don't know how you could possibly make that argument. At the same time, I don't think we can condemn him either as just hopelessly incompetent, as some people have done. David Lloyd George certainly thought he was, but he just couldn't fire him for a variety of reasons. Haig, I don't know, Scott. I think he did maybe the best he could have done with the limited knowledge he had of the changing military situation. I certainly think the Somme was a major error and a mistake. Just this idea we're just going to keep attacking until we've lost hundreds of thousands of people. Obviously, that wasn't his goal, but I don't know. I think you have to give Haig a C. What do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. In describing him in the Battle of the Somme, I was thinking about our series on key battles of the Civil War, that you have great generals, you have terrible generals, and then you have a lot of middling generals. And for whatever reason, it seemed the time frame of this matches up to the Civil War, where somewhere around the 3-year mark, a major evolutionary leap forward takes place, if we're talking about the Union side, where they're finally not using the old tactics they know demonstrably do not work, and they use new tactics that correspond to the weapons they have at the time. They're not just going off of the catechism of West Point Academy, but adapting. And that seems to be the case with World War I. So some do adapt slowly, but there are great innovators in this war, but Haig isn't one of them. He's just going with the kind of the status quo of the time.
Yeah, mostly I would agree with that. Yeah. Who's next?
All right, the next one is British Chief of Staff Henry Wilson. He left the army after the war. He became a member of Parliament. He was murdered on his doorstep by the Irish Republican Army in 1922. He was 58.
What an awful way to go. Jeez.
I mean, all domestic issues we haven't even been able to touch on in this series, but are still happening behind the scenes. And speaking of domestic issues, this is just something else with Douglas Haig I want to mention. You had talked about he was raising money for veterans. This was something that veterans of World War I in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere, they have a hard time of it. You don't have the NHS in Great Britain that are providing health care to veterans like you would after World War II. In the United States, it's not until the New Deal in the 1930s where Roosevelt is promising payouts and other services to veterans of World War I. They're really left blowing in the wind in the 1920s. And after the Great Depression begins, that continues. So many of them, for a good decade and a half, don't have social services. If they're wounded, many of them are maimed terribly. They're blinded. They have limbs that are shot off. And they basically have to depend on charity and people like Haig raising money for him. So wanted to mention that point there. But it's all of the millions and millions of casualties and wounded soldiers that leads to an overhaul of healthcare. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves in this episode, but wanted to mention that there. So the next person, let's move to France. Right. What happens to our man?
I've got the tiger. Yeah. The tiger. Yeah, it's Clemenceau. He ran for president after the war, but lost. He had been prime minister. Yeah, France, it's complicated. They have a president and a prime minister. But anyway, he didn't make it, resigned as prime minister, and spent the rest of his life traveling the world. That sounds like fun. Died in 1929 at the age of 88. So he definitely beat the odds for that day and time. I mean, even today, that would be a very long life.
All right, so that's Clemenceau. Look at Joseph Joffre. He also withdrew from public life after the war. Died in 1931 at the age of 79. And it's interesting. We're talking about these figures who try to step into public life again, who were giants of World War One, but the public is disinterested. They seem to shuttle off into obscurity. Same thing happens with Winston Churchill after World War II. I guess I would like to think that maybe there's some echoes. Tell me if I'm reaching here or not, James, because I like to reach. Sometimes I grab onto something. Sometimes I fall into the abyss. We'll see where this goes. It's kind of like the Cherokee government, where you have the war chief and the peace chief, where different ones deal with matters depending on whether they're at a state of peace or at a state of war. And the two, one step up and once resigns, depending on what's going on. And maybe the public was just fed up and they didn't want their war chief in charge of things and they wanted to move, sometimes at the drop of a hat, sometimes when the war isn't officially over. But that's the best way that I can describe how these people that are essentially running the government and keeping the very existence of the nation alive, once war is over, the public is done with them and they move on. That's my take on it.
We see that with Churchill at the end of World War II. I think there's something to be said for what you've just discussed. I think also sometimes the generals are just tired. They don't want to do anything else. Pershing, we'll talk about Pershing later, but Pershing famously had pretty much no interest in politics. So, hey, Scott, let's switch things up here and will you go ahead and do Ferdinand Foch, because his post career is similar to Joffre, and then I want to talk about Pétain.
Right. Okay, so Foch, he's also named Marshal of France, but he withdraws from public life, and he dies in 1929 at the age of 77. Yeah,
and I just continue to be, I guess I shouldn't be amazed at this, but it's just interesting to me how old so many of these generals were. I always use
the Civil War.
Yeah, you look at the Revolution, the Civil War, and you've got so many generals that are in their 40s, 30s, sometimes even 20s. You think of George Custer, among others. He's not the only one. And then these guys in the World War I, they're in their often late 50s, 60s, even 70s. World War II, it's going to be more like 50s and early 60s, I guess. But MacArthur was the exception, but yeah, these guys, I think they're just tired and they're old and tired and they're just done. I mean, a lot of these guys were about to retire before the war broke out, and then of course their retirement got put on hold. One of these is the next person that I want to discuss, and the reason I switched up the order is because Henri Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, he had a different post-war career, very different from Joffre and Foch. He did not just, he didn't just go into obscurity. He was named Marshal of France like the others, and he went into politics, but he goes from hero to villain because in 1940, after the Nazis had invaded and conquered and occupied France, the Nazis, most of our listeners know, they did not take over and directly rule all of France. They only ruled directly about half of it, and the other half they set up a puppet republic called Vichy France, because the capital was in the city of Vichy. And guess who becomes the president of Vichy France, or maybe prime minister? I forget. It doesn't matter. The leader. It's Henri Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun. In 1940, Hitler asked him to form a government. When Hitler asks something, it's not really asking.
It's not asking good faith. Yeah.
So Pétain becomes the head of the puppet state of Vichy France, or France. I don't know why I'm pronouncing it like that. After World War II, for his crime, for what he did, he was tried and he was sentenced to death. But the sentence was later commuted to life in prison. He died in 1951 at the age of 95. So he's a very complex character and a very mixed legacy. If he had died after World War I, let's say like these other guys, let's say he died in 1930 or something, then he would be, without a doubt, a major French hero. But what he did later really sullied his image, kind of like Benedict Arnold.
Right.
That analogy pops up. If Arnold had died, let's say at Saratoga, we would have schools named after him. We would have statues of him everywhere. He would be considered one of the greatest American heroes ever. But of course, that's not how things worked out.
And Pétain, I mean, I will say, I didn't read this specifically, so maybe you know better, James. His compliance with the Nazis, leader of Vichy France, I mean, I would assume that it wasn't it's not as if he's someone like Vidkun Quisling, who's openly collaborating with the Nazis and engineering a takeover of his homeland, but more he had lived so many years in the horror and devastation that he was, with those memories, he would seek a peace and try to avoid like another generation of total destruction of his homeland. But what do you know?
I don't think he was happy. He wasn't happy about it, but I think he saw it as the lesser of two evils.
Right.
I mean, what are you going to do? Lead a rebellion against the Nazis at that point, and you would have been crushed. All right, so let's move on to the Americans now. We're going to talk about three American figures. We'll start, of course, at the top with President Wilson.
Right.
As we already mentioned. Yeah.
He's
Wilson suffered. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. The order. You're doing Wilson. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm doing Wilson.
Okay, that sounds good.
Enver Pasha.
Right.
Or Kamal. I forgot which one. Well, we'll see. All right, so let's keep rolling. As we mentioned last episode, Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke on October 2nd, 1919, and he was incapacitated, first completely. Like for several weeks, he was in bed and couldn't do anything. And then partly, he never fully recovered. He did at least get to where he could sit up and at least write with one hand and do things. But he was never the same. And a lot of people, I've read that not only did his physical functioning change, but his personality changed. Like he became more rigid and less compromising. And that may be part of why he refused to compromise in the Treaty of Versailles. Maybe if he hadn't had the stroke, he would have been willing to compromise and it might have been accepted by the Senate, but that's not what happened. And you know what's amazing to me, Scott, is even despite his disability, Wilson actually wanted to run for a third term in 1920. He felt like he was the only one who could guide post-war America, but obviously everybody kind of laughed that off. Not only did Wilson not run, but the Democrats were crushed in the 1920 election, and Republican President Warren G. Harding came into office. But
truly one of our greatest presidents in American history.
Yeah, worse than Wilson, I would argue.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Hello, this is Dr. Doug Grotheis, host of Truth Tribe, where we seek the truth through reason and evidence about what matters most. And we are not tribal, since truth is for everyone. Please join me at the Truth Tribe as I discuss the reasons for Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and moral issues such as abortion and gender ideology. To listen now, go to lifeaudio.com or search Truth Tribe on your favorite podcast app.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
Anyway, so Wilson left the White House at the end of his second term in 1921. He died in 1924 at the age of 67. And he's the only president, here's a fun fact, he's the only president buried in Washington, D.C. And when I say that to somebody, they'll go, I'll tell my students, and inevitably one of them will go, well, Mr. Early, what about John F. Kennedy? John F. Kennedy's buried in D.C., right? Arlington Cemetery? And I'll say, well, that's Arlington, Virginia. So, close, but no cigar. Yeah, Kennedy and President Taft also are buried in Arlington National Cemetery, but Wilson is buried in the cemetery of the National Cathedral, which is actually in the city of D.C. So there's your fun fact. You can impress your friends and relatives, either that or just annoy them. But that's your choice, listener. But again, Wilson, only president buried in D.C. And I'm not really sure the story on that, Scott. I read a biography of Wilson and several other books about him, but it's escaping my mind at the moment why he was buried in D.C. and not back at his home. I don't know. He basically made his home in New Jersey prior to that, but I'll have to look that up, or maybe one of our listeners can look it up and email us or put it in the comments. But all right, so Wilson, moving on to General Pershing. What about him, Scott?
Well, not to tack on things that were previously said by someone, but I'm going to do that after that false caveat there. One last thing I want to mention with Wilson is,
okay,
he's interesting because with his passing, he represents a certain type of American that was very influential in the late 19th and early 20th century that really disappears after World War I. And with his disappearance and others like him, there's a certain stream of thought that also goes too. He's a progressive Christian, and I don't mean that in the 21st century term. I mean that at the time, the idealism that Wilson has, it seems foolhardy to us that we're going to create a peace that is largely going to end the enormous large-scale war we've seen before, that humanity is taking a new step forward. This isn't some type of utopian idealism. There was a section of Christianity amongst progressives, amongst people that would be congregationalists, people that would study at Union Theological Seminary. They believed in an idea called postmillennialism, which is a very fancy pants way of saying that humanity is going to get better and better and better, more education, more technological progress, less war, more enlightenment, more science.
Yeah.
Things are going to get
the post-millennial idea, like we're going to usher in the millennium and it'll be perfect and everything.
Right. It's sort of like by human progress growing and growing and growing, and then things eventually reach perfection, and then Christ returns and it's done. But we have a role to play in this. In the Ottoman Empire, I studied a lot of Western missionaries who believed in this. They set up schools in the Middle East believing we're playing an active role in this. So they were progressive in that sense, but they still had traditional beliefs, traditional theological understandings of the literal interpretation of certain things in the Bible. And that's who Wilson was. And that's who... in the negotiations in the Middle East, when there are foreign translators there, Westerners who speak Arabic and speak Turkish, many of them are Western missionaries. They were more widespread in the Middle East than many diplomats and ambassadors were at the time. So Wilson, with his passing, this type of optimism of what will happen in human affairs disappears too. So that's something that also goes with the early 20th century.
Yeah, let me piggyback on what you said. Okay, we're just turning this into the Wilson podcast here. Churchill and Wilson. That's all we're going to.
To be fair, he plays a pretty big role at the end of World War I. So, I think it's fair.
He's a fascinating. The more I read about him, the more fascinating I find Wilson. Such a complex mixture of good and bad and idealism, and yet he was also a pretty canny politician. But two things. We talked about this millennial idea, that God is going to use us, the human race, to improve the world and make things better. That the nail on the coffin is World War I. I mean, after World War I, that philosophy or theology, if you will, becomes very much a minority viewpoint. I've studied the history of theology quite a bit, and it really gives way to a more what you would call a premillennial idea, where the world, instead of the world getting better and better, it's going to get worse and worse and worse, and then Christ is going to have to come back to pick up the pieces and to repair things. I'm oversimplifying, of course.
But that idea has a lot more purchase in the Cold War, for example, and the threat of nuclear annihilation.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly seems to fit with the evidence much better if you just look at what's going on in the world. You had World War I and World War II, and like you said, the Cold War, and just it's 20th century it seems like it's the century of constant fighting, but around the world. Also, I'll add that Wilson was definitely one of the most devout Christian presidents that we'd ever had. Very religious man, went to church every Sunday, read the Bible. I mean, I think most presidents went to church a lot, but I don't know. I think a lot of them did it mainly for ceremonial or social reasons. But Wilson was a true believer. He really, as we've said repeatedly, really believed that God had called him to make the world a better place. And I mean, I'm sitting there thinking, Scott, and I'm trying to think of maybe the next time we would have a president who is that devout of a Christian. I would say Jimmy Carter, probably. I mean, and that's a long way between 1920 and 1976.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. I was thinking about that same thing. Definitely not Roosevelt, Truman. I mean, I won't go up through the whole line.
Yeah.
I think you're onto something there.
I mean, I think like for Truman, I think Christianity was very important, but I don't think it was quite as central as it was for Wilson. But anyway, all right.
So that's for listeners, I mean, I think understanding the viewpoint that Wilson came from, it really does unlock a lot of other huge figures in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, such as William Jennings Bryan, famous populist, ran for president in 1896. I forget some of his policies, but also had this type of progressive idea of things, faith and social action working together to improve the United States. Shows up in the Scopes trial against evolution. He's arguing against it. So people are sometimes surprised they learn that someone who is against evolution is also favoring some of the most progressive fiscal policies at a certain time in the United States history. But these were the progressive Christians of the Wilsonian mold, the William Jennings Bryan mold, come from this stitch. So don't see people like this today, but they were very important in a certain era of American history.
Yeah, they were religiously very conservative and traditional, but politically very progressive and just trying to help out the common man.
Okay, so after that, let's get back our American figures. John J. Pershing, he becomes Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army after the war. He wrote his memoirs and won the Pulitzer Prize for History in 1932. I think last 5-star general we've had. Is that right?
Actually, John Pershing was a 6-star.
6-star. Okay.
I don't know that he actually wrote like war and insignia with 6 stars, but he was given the rank of General of the Armies of the United States. The 5-star guys from World War II, like Ike and General Marshall and General MacArthur, they were 5-star. Their title is General of the Army, but Pershing was General of the Armies. So that's one rank above. So he was the equivalent of a 6-star, and the only other general to reach that rank was George Washington, but it was given to him in 1976 posthumously. Very interesting. I'm going to steal your thunder. I'm going to take a page out of your playbook, Scott. I'm going to jump in. I'm going to add some more stuff about Pershing because I wrote these notes like ages ago. We're recording this on July 31st, 2020, and I wrote these notes probably around the 1st of March. But read a lot about Pershing in the interim, and a couple of fascinating stories about Pershing. I may have mentioned this earlier, so if I did, forgive me. But Pershing was born in 1860. He went to West Point, really wanted to be a lawyer, but he ended up staying in the Army for a career. He went to law school even. He had a law degree, but didn't really use it. Pershing had fought in the West. He had fought in the wars against the Native Americans, and he actually commanded a unit of all-black cavalry soldiers. So that's why he was called Black Jack. Actually, the original name that people gave him was much more racist than that, but of course I'm not going to repeat that. And it was cleaned up to Black Jack, but that's why he was called Black Jack, because he led black troops. He also fought in the Spanish-American War, and he fought in the Philippines, so he had a lot of combat experience. He also led the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916, right before he was tapped to become the head of the AEF. But the interesting story about Pershing, Scott, is that in 1915, he and his family were stationed in San Francisco. In fact, they lived in the Presidio. And he was married. He had a wife that he loved very much, very devoted to this lady. And he had, I think, 3 daughters and a son, and maybe 2 daughters and a son. But when he was away from them at some point, I forget the exact details, but he was stationed somewhere else for a while. and he got a telegram saying that the Presidio, or I think it was a phone call actually, the Presidio had burned down, and tragically his wife and all of his daughters were killed in this fire. The son survived. And again, I forget the details, but yeah, I wish I could remember everything I read, Scott. I've read this story like 5 times, but I can't remember the exact details of how the son survived. But anyway, the fact of the matter is so John Pershing at the age of 55 lost his beloved wife and all of his children except one. So you can imagine he was devastated. And later on, he actually started a romantic relationship with a young lady who just happened to be the sister of George Patton. Did you know that, Scott?
Wow.
Yeah. And it's kind of, I guess, a little awkward because Patton was his aide for many years. And Pershing carried on this affair with George Patton's sister. I forget her first name. And apparently that didn't really work out. And when he was in France, he met another young lady who was of Romanian origin, but had been living in France for quite a while. And those two had an on again, off again relationship. But eventually, after Pershing got older and his health was failing, he actually went and lived in Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. He got a room there, and he got married to this lady. I mean, I think he was, I don't have his death date here. I think he lived into World War II, if I remember correctly. In fact, I know he did. I think he died in 44 or 45, but I think he got married maybe when he was about 70 or 75 or 80 to this Romanian lady that he'd had a relationship with for 20 years or so. It's a fascinating story. She moved in with him at Walter Reed. And when World War I broke out, he volunteered his services to President Roosevelt, but he was politely told thanks, but no thanks. He was 81 years old when the U.S. joined the war. So, although I believe, if I remember correctly, he was consulted for advice from time to time. But anyway, fascinating story about Pershing. Pershing is one of our generals that not many people know about. You know, let's say, if I were to survey my class, and have you heard of Grant? They would say, yeah. Have you heard of George Washington? Duh. Have you heard of Eisenhower? Have you heard of MacArthur? Most of them would say yes. But if I said, have you heard of Pershing? I bet nobody would. But I think he deserves credit for what he did. I don't know that he was one of our best generals in terms of his battlefield ability. He was more of a planner. He did commit a lot of mistakes that the French and British had already been there, done that, got the T-shirt, right? But I think, so I wouldn't rank him among our greatest military leaders, but in terms of his ability to build an army from nothing, to train, to oversee training, to oversee supply, logistics, and planning and things like that, I think he's definitely one of the best.
Yeah, he's a logistician, an Ike, a Longstreet, others. And one last Pershing thing, since we're kind of stuck on him, is I was at a World War I exhibit in St. Louis in 2018, so the centennial of the end of the war. And they're blown up in an exhibit that was probably 10 feet high, was one of the letters between Pershing and his mistress at the time. So there you go. Decades later, your dirty laundry is on full view for the public to take a look at. So he'd probably be embarrassed knowing that. But
well, he did get a cruise missile named after him. I remember back in the 80s, there was a lot of talk of Pershing cruise missiles.
Yeah, there's a World War I museum in Kansas City where I reside, and it's on Pershing Street. So a little bit of his legacy there.
Excellent.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
Hello, this is Dr. Doug Groothuis, host of Truth Tribe, where we seek the truth through reason and evidence about what matters most. And we are not tribal, since truth is for everyone. Please join me at the Truth Tribe as I discuss the reasons for Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and moral issues such as abortion and gender ideology. To listen now, go to lifeaudio.com or search Truth Tribe on your favorite podcast app.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
All right, whose turn is it? I lost track. Sorry, folks. My notes have 2 sentences, but there's just too much. Some of these guys, there's so much good stuff to talk about.
So you had Alvin York.
Yeah, I got York. Okay, good. So Alvin York, we talked about his incredible story. After the war, he worked to promote education in Tennessee, and he served as a supervisor in the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which was one of the New Deal agencies created under President Roosevelt. He tried to re-enlist in the Army when World War II broke out, but he was turned down due to his age and his poor health. However, he was given a commission as a major in the Army Signal Corps. And as I've already mentioned, but I want to mention it again, he was immortalized in the 1941 film Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper as York. And Alvin York died in 1964. Lived a good long life at the age of 76.
All right. Well, let's look at the Central Powers, and here is someone who did not live a good long life. And
no,
I don't have a lot to say about him, but Emperor Karl I, emperor without an empire, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he went into exile. He dies of tuberculosis in 1922 at the age of 35. And as we go down this list of Central Powers, we're going to see a lot of people. Imagine after the Bolshevik Revolution, where the Russian aristocracy, those who aren't killed, are able to flee, so they end up in Parisian cafes, and they have the glamour and the illustriousness of being aristocrats, but the base of power, the things that made them who they were, are gone. So I don't like the term wrong side of history. I think it casts judgment on the past and prevents us from understanding its nuance, but one could say they're on the wrong side of history, and they don't really have a place to go. They're in exile, and the great powers don't really know what to do with them. So this is Karl, and this is a number of these other figures too. So what happens to Konrad von Hotzendorf?
Yes, good old Konrad. Konrad was, of course, the head of the Austro-Hungarian army, not the best general that's ever worn the uniform. After the war, he went to live in Germany, and he wrote his memoirs and died. Most of these guys did that, by the way. We're not going to mention that every single time, but he died in 1925 at the age of 73.
Right.
That's all I have. Not too much to say.
Kaiser Wilhelm II, he daughters around in exile. He goes to the Netherlands. He dies in 1941 at the age of 82. An interesting fact is when he died, he was putting pins in a map to mark the progress of the German army. So he too is, I think, kind of relishing in what Germany is able to do. Maybe he dies. Not that I like Nazi Germany in any way, but I suppose the very little it does is it gives this old man a bit of hope that his Reich is going to be restored for whatever that's worth. Don't know what to say about that. So that's Kaiser Wilhelm's end. Going down the list, what happens to our famed namesake of a blimp?
Paul von Hindenburg. Yeah, yes. He, despite his advanced age, remember he was, I think, 67 when World War I started. So not a spring chicken by any stretch of the imagination. He actually came out of retirement to run for president of Germany in 1925. This is another situation where you have a president and a prime minister, which in Germany is called the chancellor. He won this election for president. He defeated Ludendorff, of all people.
They just don't know how to turn the page. Wow.
Exactly. Yeah. And in 1932, at the age of 85, he was elected president again, defeating Adolf Hitler. So Hitler had run for president, which is more of a ceremonial position. It had some power, but it wasn't as powerful as the chancellor. But one power that the president did have at the time was to appoint the chancellor. And having defeated Hitler and become the president of Germany in 1932, the next year, Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. And we know what happened after that. Famous bad decisions. Hindenburg dies in 1934 at the age of 87 and famously has a blimp named after him.
So you mentioned Erich Ludendorff, and in the previous episode, or was it 2 episodes ago? That's right. At the end of the war, when Germany is in terminal decline and he resigns, there's applause throughout Germany in movie halls, and so he skulks away in disguise to Sweden. Mm-hmm. Eventually, he returns to Germany. He becomes involved in 2 coup attempts, including the Beer Hall Putsch with Adolf Hitler in 1923. He ran for president in 1925 and fails, and then he died in 1937 at the age of 72. So the old guard shuttles off, so they seem to be the final breaks to prevent the rise of Hitler, and when they're gone, then doesn't seem to be anything standing in his way.
Right. All right, well, here's somebody that doesn't even survive the war. This is Helmut von Moltke. We haven't talked about him in a long time, but to refresh your memory, listener, he was the German chief of staff at the beginning of World War I. He's the man who had modified and tweaked the famous Schlieffen Plan and then was responsible for carrying it out. And of course, he failed to take Paris and conquer France, so he was removed. His health declined after he was removed, and he died in 1916 at the age of 68. So kind of a sad situation for him.
And then Erich von Falkenhayn.
Yeah, his successor.
Like a lot of our generals here, after the war is over, he withdraws from public life. Doesn't last too much longer. He dies in 1922 at the age of 61.
All right. Now, moving into the Ottoman or Turkish figures. This is Scott's all-time favorite World War I leader, Mustafa Kemal. He became a war hero for the second time in the Greco-Turkish War, which, if people don't know about that, the Greeks were awarded the city of Smyrna, modern-day Izmir, as part of the Treaty of Sèvres, if I remember correctly. So the Greeks, and there were a lot of Greeks living there. The Greeks, I mean, that had been a Greek city for thousands of years, right, Scott? Literally,
yeah,
going back
time
to ancient times, when the Ottomans took over Anatolia, they didn't purge it of Greeks or anything. So you had a huge Greek community in Western Anatolia, and particularly Smyrna. But the Greeks got a little bit big for their britches, and the Greeks decided they were going to not just settle for this western part of Anatolia, but they were going to go ahead and try to take over more of Anatolia, and maybe even all of Turkey if they could. The Greeks wanted to re-establish, I guess, the Byzantine Empire, the Greek Empire, and so they launched an attack, and Mustafa Kemal was the leader of the Turkish forces defending Anatolia, and he led a counterattack, and he basically crushed the Greeks, and then you had a great slaughter of Greeks, a very sad situation in which there were many atrocities committed, and after that, there were pretty much no Greeks in Smyrna or Izmir. But anyway, but Kemal obviously was greatly lionized by the Turkish people for driving away the invading Greeks. He was given the honorary title Ataturk, which means father of the Turks. And he died, and he was the first president of modern-day Turkey. Died in 1938 at the age of 57. That's pretty young, Scott. What happened to him?
Cirrhosis of the liver. He was a heavy drinker. He enjoyed rakı. It's the national drink. It's kind of like ouzo, if you know the Greek drink. And
the Bosnians have the same thing. They just call it rakia. Yeah, but I'm sure they got the word from Turkish and just modified it slightly.
Yeah, Balkans, Turkey, all their food is the same, but they all have different names for it and claim that other nations stole it from them. So such is life in southeastern Europe and Asia Minor. He drank a lot. In the biography of him by Patrick Kinross said that he had an incredibly active mind. He He would do all-nighters constantly. He would think about different things in Turkey, and he claimed that the only way he could sleep was essentially to drink himself to sleep, but maybe he just liked to drink. I could say 1,000 things about Ataturk. I'll just say one thing, though. He died on November 10th in 1938 at a former palace of the Sultan, Dolmabahce. Still to this day in Turkey, there is a moment of silence commemorating his death. So at the time in which he died, I think it's 9:05. If you're outside, there will be emergency sirens will blare. People will come to a complete stop wherever they're walking on the streets. Cars will stop on roads. One day I knew this was happening, so I went to an overpass on a very busy highway in Istanbul, and it happened. People stopped their cars. They got out. They were honking their horns. So maybe
I thought you said a moment of silence.
So yeah, it's not really. I think things are never silent in Istanbul and a lot of Turkey. So maybe it's more a moment of stopping. If that's better.
Yeah. Stop what you're doing and raise Cain.
Right. So they'll stop and they'll do that. And his monuments of him are everywhere. He had famous sayings: "Peace at home, peace abroad." One day we'll die, but the Turkish Republic will last forever. Anything in courthouses, there are pictures of him. It said the foundation of a nation is justice. Big impact. But I'm just going to stop because I don't want to blather on forever about Ataturk. I'll just mention some things about Enver Pasha, who was part of the military triumvirate that led the war in the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan dismissed Enver from his post as war minister on October 4th, 1918, while the rest of Talat Pasha's government resigned. And then on October 30th, the Ottoman Empire capitulated. They signed an armistice agreement, the Armistice of Mudros. They go to different places. On January 1st, 1919, the new government expelled Enver Pasha from the army. He was tried in absentia in the Turkish court-martial for crimes of plunging the country into war without a legitimate reason, the forced deportation of Armenians, the Armenian genocide, which he talked about in 1915, and leaving the country without permission, and he was condemned to death. Well, he flees to Germany, then he flees to Moscow. He had some friends in the Bolshevik Revolution, and then he goes to Turkmenistan in Central Asia. He took command of the anti-Soviet rebels and was killed in the fighting in 1922 at the age of 41. Very colorful character.
Yeah, they chopped his head off, didn't they? I was reading about that recently.
All right. Well, speaking of Russia, what happened to our beloved Russian/Soviet figures?
Yes, we'll start with the general. Well, we've already talked about what happened to Tsar Nicholas. Obviously, we don't need to go into more detail about that. So let's talk about probably their most brilliant general, Alexei Brusilov. He joined the Red Army after the Russian Revolution, so he switched sides, essentially. He retired in 1924, and he died 2 years later at the age of 72. So he's one of the few that we've come across, the few generals that actually stayed very active in the military. Yeah, of the senior commanders, obviously. Mm-hmm. We didn't even talk about people like Patton and, well, we talked a little about some of these guys, Patton and George Marshall and MacArthur, and obviously those guys are all going to stay in the Army and have a big future. We talked a little about Harry Truman, who did not stay in the Army, but nevertheless had a big future. So I'm getting off track here where I'm talking about Americans, but I just think it's interesting that among all the senior people, most of them just, as we've seen, just retired and left public life with very few exceptions. All right, so that's Brusilov.
Yeah, Kerensky is interesting, Alexander Kerensky. And earlier I had mentioned fate of exiles, like Russian aristocrats that end up in France or elsewhere. He's an example of someone like that. He lived in exile the rest of his life in Paris and New York. He taught at Stanford University, and he lived until 1970 when he died at the age of 89. And I'll just mention briefly that many famous academics got their start as exiles. So Kerensky is one example. In my field of Middle Eastern studies or Ottoman studies, that really kicks off in the 1930s when professors from Germany, whether they're Jewish or whether they're simply dissidents against the Nazi regime, they flee. A lot of them came to the University of Chicago. So a lot of Ottomanists were Germans who fled. Egyptology, studying the pharaohs, kicks off in the 1930s with the University of Chicago as well. even in Turkey, other Germans went there. So many of them became professors at the University of Istanbul at the 1930s and 1940s and helped build their academic system. Because in the Weimar period, the person that you looked up to as an academic or building a university were the Germans. The same way that before World War I, you would look up to the Prussians. If you wanted to build up your army, you would need a Prussian military advisor. In the 1930s, if you wanted to build up your university, you would look to Germany again. And so exiles have their role to play there. But not to get off on tangents too much, which seems to be the theme of this episode.
Yeah, really. We said this is going to be a short episode, and we end up talking all day. But it's good stuff, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us about our friend Vladimir Lenin. Where does he go?
Did you finish up Kerensky? I'm sorry, I zoned out for
a minute. No, yeah. Well, that's all I have to say about Kerensky. He lives to the age of 89.
Yeah, in 1970, I think he's lived the longest, or at least the latest, of any of the people in this episode. All right, so I get Lenin. Lenin, not too much to say about him. Obviously, he becomes the first leader of the Soviet Union, but he doesn't last very long. We saw in a previous episode, we talked about an assassination attempt. Actually, I believe there were multiple assassination attempts of Lenin. And he carried some wounds from those, and they got worse and worse. And he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage in 1924 and died at the age of only 54. And of course, he's going to be replaced by Joseph Stalin, who is going to be like Lenin on steroids, like even worse. But again, that's a story for another series.
All right. And then the last person here is Leon Trotsky. And this goes to show that if you're going to be a revolutionary, your troubles aren't over once a revolution is over, because when your whole legitimacy is based on overthrowing another person, you're really making it okay for someone else to come along and overthrow you. So live by the sword, die by the sword. And Leon Trotsky loses a power struggle with Joseph Stalin after the war, and he's forced into exile in 1929. For the rest of his life, he's pursued by Stalin's agents. He goes around the world. He ends up in Mexico. That's where Stalin's agents catch up to him, and he's murdered in 1940 at the age of 60.
Yeah, the great way to learn about the Stalin and Trotsky struggle is to read the book Animal Farm by George Orwell, which on the surface is about a bunch of pigs that can talk and other animals, but it's really about Stalin and Trotsky. It's fascinating. My daughter just read it in school recently.
Right. If you pursue radicalism, you have to be careful because you're not safe. Someone further radical than you will eventually take you out as well in the course of the revolution. So the point being that the revolution eventually eats its own or takes complete power in one person. Lesson there with the Soviet Revolution. All right. Well, we looked at a lot of people and we went a lot of different directions, but with people like this, it's almost impossible not to. So we have one final episode in the series. We've talked a little about the legacy of the First World War, but it's not just in political boundaries. It's not just how war is fought. It is in almost everything, in the economic legacies of Europe and the rest of the world, in geographic legacies, in gender roles, in roles of governments, changes to nations, ideological changes, other conflicts that spring out of it. And then we're going to wrap up this entire series by asking a question that we've come to a few times, but I want to tackle in a little bit more and ask, was World War I worth it? So that's all for this episode, and we'll see you in the next episode and the last episode in this series and wrap things up.